Terry is actually one of my students, so during the Q&A session, I was going to ask Anthony to come up here if you guys want to hear things from my perspective or from the inside of the Matrix. So, how many people here have seen The Matrix, the movie? And it's one of those metaphors that I thought was priceless for discussing performativity theory and the creation of identities and the stabilization and sedimentation of identities. And how do I move forward? This arrow?
Yeah.
That arrow. Yay! Okay, so I'm a third-year SLAT student. My major is language use. I have a really strong passion for critical discourse analysis, for semiotics, issues of ideology and the homologies that make those ideologies appear normative. I'm also really passionate about pedagogy, which is my minor, and in particular technology and emergent technologies, transient technologies. And the use of whatever helps, right? Past, present, future, to be open. I keep doing the wrong thing. I'm not a technology expert, obviously. So, what I'd like to discuss is performativity and gender and LT use, which we've been talking about. And I noticed on the list there are many of us speaking about performativity today. But what are some problems, what are some difficulties that performativity has created while it tried to solve other problems? And then looking at some possible solutions that I'm trying to implement even within the classroom and outside of the classroom. Okay, not going to do this again. So the great thing about performativity, I don't want to preach to the choir, but the great thing was its destabilization of these norms related to gender, related to identity, to ethnicity, the breaking down the dominant power and questioning, right? Who are you to tell me what masculinity is, what femininity is? And performativity also has been great in its questioning language and language legislation. You know, what is English and why are you trying to impose this English? Why is this textbook forcing me to use this English when, for instance, there is Indian English that is extremely porous, right, and being used elsewhere, Australian English and British English, and other cultural uses of English that don't fit the paradigm that is imposed. So that's the good side of performativity. I did it again. But Judith Butler has dominated performativity when it comes to gender studies and queer studies to such an extent that it is almost impossible to talk about gender and queer studies without thinking within the matrix established by Judith Butler. And in her explanation of this, there is an infinite regression, right, to where there is no core, there's no essence per se, but it is all a performative act that creates and sediments the illusion of femininity and masculinity. Cameron would go so far as to say, right, that we're moving away from gender difference and binary difference to masculinities and femininities. And this is how we look at gender. And when we, from our Western perspective, go to other parts of the world, we read performativity right into the other culture. So it did give us new ways of thinking about language, identity, and change. It was helpful. It is still helpful. It is a great theory. However, it is not a theory, as Kulik would point out. It is a philosophy. There's a big difference with that. We'll see how this philosophy impacts us even today. In fact, it's a philosophy which defines ontology and our doing, the act, and its consequences. For instance, a good example, and I've used this many times, and you know it, but when Barrett was looking at African American drag queens, this wasn't just a performance of femininity, right, a version of femininity, but these African American drag queens were performing upper-class white Parisian women, thus crossing gender boundaries, cultural. The ambiguity of what performativity is complex. Equally, Lakoff discovered that white drag queens often impersonate African American women, but of a certain social class. And so we're seeing that it's blended. There's a stylization, so I mentioned that earlier today. I think it was you mentioning stylization of performativity. So let's look at it this way. Everybody knows Lady Gaga? Of course. So let's think of Lady Gaga as a language, if you can. You guys remember the meat dress? Right? After we forget. So she could come across as innocent, scholarly, maybe an icon from cinema. maybe appropriating religious symbols for a bit of perversion in those symbols. But is this really performativity? Or is Vogue magazine, in fact, framing a core identity? Does Vogue know exactly who Lady Gaga is? And in spite of the performativity in the stage of identity, does Lady Gaga know who she is? So identity, gender, and language may be play, but without non-play, the word is meaningless. You'll notice even on this cover here, Lady Gaga is playing even not only with gender. You guys remember when she came out Music Awards as a man, right? But even language itself, she's trying to make the you look other, right? There's an otherness to you and I, even playing with the stereotypes of otherness. So are we as language users also imposters? Are we performing languages with words? Do we sediment and establish something that appears real and authentic? I teach Italian, by the way. So Antonio can tell me, we only use Italian in the classroom, and I'm always trying to sediment something as real as Italian, authentic Italian. But there's a problem with that. Antonio would know we present multiple ways of being Italian, multiple versions of Italian, and not just the standard established by the RAI. And every time we say, write it like Americans write it, Antonio, write it like Italians write it, Antonio could challenge me and say, which Italians? Right? What version of Italian? So, like gender, the essentialism is inherent in SLA, second language acquisition, is reinforced through literacy and standardization processes. It is seen in the kind of textbooks we use. And the good side is that performativity limits the value of that standardization. So what's the problem? Right? We're all on the same page. We all agree. Well, the problem is that doing, acting, and consequences are less than ontology itself. They do not say much of anything regarding ontology or identity if there is in fact no core essence. Julia Serrano is a transgendered author. Her words are powerful. Don't you dare dismiss my gender as construct, drag, or performance. My gender is a work of non-fiction. These words are actually mild compared to some of the literature that's coming out by the LGBT community against performativity theory. And why? Because the transgender community relies on binary in order to exist, in order to fight for the human rights. And as Shep would say, the attitude now is shifting to no binary, just watch me. Right? This is a transgendered person who actually won in a pageant. But it relies, if you look at the illusion that is created, it relies on a binary construct. And if I talk to this woman and I say, well, you don't understand, the performativity behind it is really an illusion, there is no need to establish male or female, who am I to say that? The language gets stronger. There was a poetry reading by the LGBT community in San Francisco recently, and one particularly angry poem recited by a transgender woman started by cursing various social groups and institutions, families, Republicans, women's studies departments, and ended with the blatant attack. So we hear, right, this is brutal. This is brutal. There's something wrong with performativity that needs to be addressed. What is it? Well, it is a form of cultural imperialism. If I interpret all gender construct a certain way, I'm imposing that on the rest of the world and presuming universality. I am forcing on you a truth regime, which is ironic because performativity questions the very concept of truth and essence. Also, performativity, according to the LGBT community, is ignoring the physical resistance to performative acts. It is closed to new possibilities. And why is it a convenient assumption? Because anytime Butler is challenged on why these theories do go so far but fail in some areas, she does not address. She conveniently redirects. And it creates a closed system of ethics. Is it really that original? Not really. You will hear Judith Butler borrow from Derrida, Lyotard, Lacan, Baudrillard, the infinite referral, the infinite regression into nothingness where there is no essence. the death of ontology promoted by Lyotard, or Lacan's self as other, the mirror stage, or Baudrillard's simulacra, and the idea that we forget through repetitious and performative acts that there is no essence to it. And the fake replaces the real, if there ever was a real in the first place. The biggest irony of all is that for the first time, postmodernism has kissed fundamentalism and given a little tongue in the process. Right? What do we mean by that? Performativity says to the core of your being, you are not gay. You are not straight. You are not male. You are not female. You. There is an infinite regression into the fact that there's nothing but construct. Religious fundamentalism, especially in the United States, and now it's moving across the world, and I'm speaking about evangelical Christian fundamentalism, has a series of groups called ex-gay movements, Exodus International, Love in Action, and groups like this who use performativity as a means of saying, you're not essentially gay. No one really is. You don't have to be gay. Oh, by the way, we can change you too. Right? It's the first time that performativity and religious fundamentalism are actually starting to agree, and yet these are not good bedfellows, right? So what Butler appropriates is something she cannot appropriate, and that is the sense of self. When you talk and listen to the discourses of the transgender community, the LBG community, ultimately it is about who do I sense myself to be. The very idea that a male would want to transition to female or a female to male is based on a sense of who I am. And that is something she cannot appropriate. But there are further problems. Butler goes to argue that the law creates hate speech in order to legislate hate speech. The law creates hate speech, and in the process, the belated metalepsis, the subject effect. She's very careful to not say subject, the subject effect. It's all a power issue in Butler's framework, in Butler's matrix. And what she recommends is that victims of hate speech do not fight back as much as re-signify the hate speech and appropriate it. Fag? I'll accept it. Bitch? I'll take it on. That is not what Martin Luther King did. That is not what Gandhi did. That is not what happened at Stonewall. There was not a reappropriation of the enemy's discourse or speech. There was a pointing to the discourse and saying, this is ethically wrong, and we will stand against it. Thus, the need for a you and an I was absolutely essential in the fight for human rights. And the irony of Butler's paradox, the irony of Butler's matrix is the fact that even though it seems to liberate us and bring us all into this relativistic world of meaning-making, right? Like social discourses that create meaning, it really promotes a moral and political individualism. Human rights and social justice require the sense of language and identity as real. The sense of it is real. And performativity does not value that sense of authentic and non-constructive being. It is a useful tool, but in a sense, Butler forgot when to stop deconstructing. In order to say no to Islamophobia, which actually our keynote speaker is going to be talking about that, right? No to Islamophobia and no to homophobia. You don't need subject effects. You need real subjects in the discourse. And you need real people. So, no. I use an iPad, sorry. So what am I doing in the classroom? An ontological approach to second language acquisition. It unmasks the performativity. It uses it when necessary, but it reveals a human being whose desire must not be discounted or explained away. In fact, we discussed desire last night over dinner, a concept that Kulik discusses extensively. And what I'm using is social networking, because sometimes what you'll see happen on social networking sites is performative. Not always, right? Allowing students to think outside of the performative box. And what my students are doing over and over is the establishment of authentic identities, the establishment of what they're trying to seek to do with a second language, right? Antonio, you want to become an Italian speaker, right? And be Italian as much as you can through the use of various expressions. But it is complex. These are dynamic frameworks. So don't let the complexity, the dynamic system, confuse the fact that there is a desire in a core human being. So the way I see it is social networking is allowing me to facilitate a post-method pedagogy, and it's free to consider extant theory, method, and methodology. I often hear, oh, don't do that. That is a passé methodology. Who cares? If it works and the students are doing it, let's bring it back, right? It doesn't follow a fixed paradigm. There's no need for it. And it works with the fluidity of identity and language without reducing either to fiction. If I have a student who really wants to show herself to be a Democrat, Buddhist, feminist, atheist, Christian, I'm going to respect that identity on Facebook and allow her to co-create it with others. And what I'm dealing with are digital natives. I'm older, I'm 42 years old, but Antonio, you were born with digital, right, technology. These are active learners, team builders, collaborators, and discoverers. And it allows them to do so much. It allows them to create identity and to play with language and to establish who they are individually and collectively. Students are using it as blogs, as a form of wiki, to chat, gaming, videos, articles, debate. We use it for exam review, composition writing, research, multilingual, multicultural awareness, second language socialization. They use it for fantasy play, identity creation. And also, it is a non-threatening, it's a non-judgmental environment. And it allows for more communication than face-to-face interactions in the classroom. And more than anything, it takes away my power as a teacher to be the sole authority of Italian knowledge, right? Students get to co-create online their versions of Italian. The problems I'm experiencing is that Facebook sometimes by students is perceived as a play place and not a place to engage with work. That's a problem. The other problem I'm experiencing, and this is what I'm bringing up to you, is assessment. How do I assess work that is this fluid? And if I'm using complexity theory, dynamic systems theory, and I'm allowing the class to be free in their engagement, how do you assess that kind of work when you're moving away from rigid grading systems? So ultimately, exit the matrix now and then. Use performativity to establish identity, to destabilize English or Italian, and then sometimes step outside of it to learn, to give students the freedom to establish a sense of Italian, a sense of identity. And let's move beyond just merely doing with language and identity, and let's experience languaging as a verb, as an action, and becoming. That's it. So, any questions, address me, address Antonio as a student. If you want two different perspectives, here we go. This hasn't been staged or rehearsed. Yes?
I think it's really interesting, and it's great that you're challenging this really pervasive notion of performativity, which does a lot of work in a lot of places and comes from a lot of sources, right? Obviously, you're talking about Butler's performativity here more so than an Austin or somebody like that. My question, though, would be, how do you get to languaging and creating identities if you don't have a notion of performativity of some sort? Right? Because if you're actually dealing with an essence, then I don't see, without some notion of bringing into being through social, not necessarily individual, forms of performativity, how you could, become something if there's not something that's worked out in the interaction that then feeds back into whatever was.
Well, a good example would be when I have students who believe that their gender identity is, let's say I have a student who has a religious perspective on how gender identity is created. As an instructor, why would I impose performativity on that student who sees their identity as that God-given, right, identity? Let it be. So the intercultural awareness on my part is to suspend my disbelief, step into the shoes of the student, and try to see the world and their identity from their perspective. Doesn't mean I have to agree, right? But it means that I'm not going to delegitimize their version of gender or sexual orientation or faith or whatever they bring as part of their core identity. I'm going to respect it. Performativity, I love performativity. A lot of people, when they say, oh, you're problematizing, oh my God, he's attacking Butler, burn him at the stake. No, a lot of my work is built on the idea of performativity. I'm just trying to say it is our baby, and not everybody on the outside of this matrix sees it that way.
I see some parallels in your work. The differences between what performance is in the kind of classical, traditional sense of performance.
Like
which
Austin?
Is,
Or like a golf movie.
like, anyway, so we can talk more about that. But the idea that you have this performance as public event and spectacle, at some level, I see that you're trying to draw some parallels between like this very public display, including issues of gay rights activism and LGBTQ speech, that's in a very publicized political arena.
Right.
And I see that paralleling to Facebook as also very public sort of performance. But I think that there's a difference between performance and performativity.
Totally.
So
yes.
I think there needs to be some addressing of like the nuance between those things.
Yeah.
So for example, like if you're a drag queen for performance. You're not a drag queen maybe like when you go home and cook dinner, right? So there's that high level of performance, and then there's language and performativity. So I think moving forward with your sort of like experiment right here with Facebook, I think that needs to be addressed at some level more critically.
The way I'm seeing the difference there is performance, if I go back to Austin's speech act theory, performance, yeah, you're doing something. Like if I say, my God, it's really hot in here, I'm really, might be indirectly asking you to open the window or something. What I'm doing, by the way, what I do with speech act is one thing, but performativity actually is different, that it actually questions the essence itself. It goes even further. But with students, and I'd love for Antonio to say a word or two, from his perspective, like from the classroom, how this has impacted you guys to allow this freedom and fluidity. And
I feel like in a normal classroom, students are just viewed as like everybody else, and no one has their own personal identity, like in a large classroom or even in a small classroom. But with this Facebook stuff we're doing in the class, everybody gets their own identity. We get to post what we want, what we like. Like if I want to post an article about the musical artist that I like, I can post that, and then people know that about me. I can post my religious views or what I did that day, and then people can start viewing me as a person, as who I am, and everybody has their own individuality about it, and I think that's a great thing, and you're also learning the new language at the same time, so it's just beneficial in many ways.
I think it was so weird.
Well, I think you're really touching on something that I have a lot of personal interest in, and I'm really glad that you're doing it in this way. I spent a lot of time with our campus's LGBTQ resource center, dealing with people coming from very conservative religious backgrounds, and discovering like their sexuality and identity, and dealing with the things that they come from religious communities that see performativity or the agentive subject as one that is engaged in sin, or engaged in righteous work, and so their response usually to that is that like, hey, I am not an agentive individual, and that like I can't make up my identity purely, but that I am gay, and
right.
that like and that it's not just about me acting out on like in a sinful way. But
right, the religious argument is performative at the core.
Right,
like
yeah.
You are being
right.
a sinner.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Not being, you are doing the sinner act, right?
Right.
Establishes that, yeah.
Yeah, but, you know, one of the things that I'm that has always kind of made me still uneasy about it is that